Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, May 30th. My name is Heather Kraus, and I'm a mathematical statistician, and I live in Toronto. And I'm the founder of an organization called We All Count. And the purpose of We All Count is to help build tools and develop communities that have practical, concrete ways to embed their equity values in the work that they do with evidence and data. And as you know, one of my very favorite things that We All Count does every week is on Friday, we hold Talking Data Equity. And if this is your first time, I'm very, very happy you've picked a great Friday to join us. And I already see lots and lots of regulars. And I really appreciate people who come on a regular basis and make this community a reality. The idea behind Talking Data Equity is that anybody from any country and any sector who wants to learn more about like the concrete real world practice of embedding equity in data projects, in evidence, in policy can come. They can share resources, they can ask for help, they can share successes, they can share challenges, and they can be reminded that they are not alone. It can easily feel, especially right now, that you're the only one left that cares, but you're not. And there's lots of good work still being done. And today we have an incredibly exciting special guest. I have been excited about this for really as soon as Tamika agreed to come. I've been excited. And one of the things I want to mention before I do my formal introduction of Tamika is that this is going to be recorded. And the reason that we record these is so that we can share them back in our data equity forum with people who can't always be here live. So I'm sharing in the chat the link to where we will put, there's going to be lots of resources. Tamika's website is already amazing. There's so many books that we're going to want to recommend as well, papers. And so we're going to put all those links in the data equity forum. So you don't have to try and write everything down. You can sit back and relax. We're going to ask that you keep your microphone turned off while Tamika is sharing her stories and her examples. And then you can use the chat, use the Zoom chat if you want. But if there's time at the end, that's when we'll do a mics on Q&A. Okay, so those are all the logistics. And let me introduce you to Tamika Butler, who is amazing, super dope. Pronouns she, her, or they, them. Tamika is a doctoral student in urban planning at UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs, and her research employs a critical race, historical, legal, and policy-based approach to examine how transportation policy and infrastructure has been used to segregate, isolate, and prevent the mobility of Black and other historically oppressed people. Prior to pursuing her PhD, Tamika consulted, wrote, and spoke as a national expert on issues related to public policy, the built environment, equity, anti-racism, diversity, inclusion, organizational behavior, and change management. So you can see why I'm so excited. She transitioned to policy work after litigating for 3 years as an employment lawyer. Yes, on top of all of this, Tamika is a lawyer at the Legal Aid Society Employment Law Center and has a diverse background in law, community organizing, and nonprofit leadership. She received her JD from Stanford Law School and her BA in psychology and BS in sociology in her hometown of Omaha, Nebraska. Right now lives in LA with her wife and kids. And one last thing is that there was a particular data equity regular community attendee who sent me many, many emails begging me to get in touch with Tamika, especially when we started talking about some transportation issue things. And that person can't be here today, so they will watch the video, but they specifically said, can you please pass along to Tamika that their work has infused my own transportation advocacy lens, and most importantly, my ability to respect and elevate lived experiences so very different than mine in our vision of different transportation world. Your work is having such an impact. Thank you for doing your work. So I wanted to make sure that that person got to say to you what they wanted to say after all these weeks and months. Thank you, Tamika, for making time in your schedule. I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to that person for for helping me get here. Let me share my screen and we can get started. All right. So hopefully everybody can see the slides. Great. As you heard, I'm Tamika. I like to start off all of my talks with these affirmations. Let's move this guy. Um, And I like to start with these affirmations because for folks who don't know me, I just think it's important to know that this is where I'm coming from with everything. So it's the same way as like if you think the world is flat, like I appreciate that for you, but like I don't know that we're always going to be starting from the same place, right? And many of these affirmations came from Dr. Hoover, an assistant professor in North Carolina, who started a talk that I was on a panel with her like this, and I think it's important to just kind of set that foundation. So just kind of a roadmap. I am a planner, so a little bit of a roadmap for what we're gonna do. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about who I am. I'll go through that quick because you just heard a long bio. I'll tell you from my perspective, while why planners and people in my field should care about the things that I care about, and then we'll talk a little bit about individual actions people can take. So. Who am I? As you heard, I went to Stanford Law School. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska. I know there are some Canadians, so Omaha is very much in the middle of the country, probably viewed the same way that people view like Winnipeg, um, above above the border. My wife's family is French Canadian, so I actually spend quite a bit of time in Canada, maybe more in the next few years. You never know with what's happening here. But I moved out to California to go to law school. Thought I was going to be a civil rights lawyer, as I think, many queer folks of color, you want to make an impact for your community, and you often hear, you can do education, you can do this, you can do that, and being a civil rights lawyer is one of them. And I was a rising, successful lawyer, doing good work, winning awards, and my job, fresh out of law school, was to start a legal clinic. That served the historically black communities of San Francisco. And for people who don't know the history of San Francisco, it's a common United States city story where during World War II it became a big port city. A lot of black folks moved to the area for jobs. The war ended, and so a lot of black folks still lived in this community, Bayview Hunters Point, but it was geographically isolated from the rest of the city. Didn't have a ton of services, and my job was to start workers' rights clinics there. And it just so happened to be at a time where SF Muni, the Municipal Transit Authority, was starting a new rail line that went out to Bayview Hunters Point. And because I wasn't from the community, even though I was black, I was clearly not from the community. And so before people could trust me with their employment issues, they wanted to know what I thought about the new rail line. They wanted to know where my politics lied. And a lot of what I heard about was how did people make these decisions about where this train is going? How did they make decisions about the stops? How did they make decisions about timing? The number of community members who you wouldn't think about data, who are like, did they even look at the data? Do they even know where we're at? And the common refrain I heard was the only data they cared about is the data the San Francisco 49ers gave them. The San Francisco 49ers, the football team, they now play in Santa Clara, which is what Bay Area people call the South Bay. But at the time, they had a stadium in Bayview Hunters Point, Candlestick Park. It's just like iconic stadium in the National Football League. And people really thought that that's what this train line was for, to get people in and out as quick as possible and not actually serve the needs of the people in the community. And so, even though I was a civil rights employment lawyer, this was the first time I really heard about how important transportation was to linking people to other resources. The former mayor of Los Angeles used to say, transportation is a prism through which we should see all other social justice issues. And I think that's something that was really salient to me as I talked to these folks. But that's a totally different life. How did I get here? And basically, I have like 17 jobs and I do a lot. I do have my own consulting practice where I work on a number of projects, whether it's, executive coaching for folks at different government agencies, whether or not it's working with nonprofits or the traditional kind of planning. A city puts out an RFP, consultants put together teams, and we go after the project to build the bike lane, or in LA to work on the Olympics or whatever it may be, right? And so I do that, and I really try to focus on how can I help government clients, um, and because my background is in bicycle advocacy, and being a movement lawyer, I want to make sure to balance as much work as I can with helping advocacy, and nonprofit NGO groups, and I do a lot of that work pro bono. And then I mix in a fair share of trying to write and do public speaking like I am here. And because that doesn't keep me busy, or my 4-year-old and 6-year-old don't keep me busy, I'm also in the fourth year of a PhD program at UCLA, in urban planning. And I'm really focused on how people travel and why they travel. What is that travel behavior? Thinking about specifically like Black folks and neighborhoods and what that looks like. And then thinking about the spatial relationship between transportation, race, and poverty. This is a very text-heavy slide. If you haven't already noticed, I really like a lot of pictures. This is very text-heavy, so for people who can't digest it, I explain that, like, basically, I'm just rooting for everybody Black, right? Like, I just firmly believe that if Black folks can get free, it will mean freedom for so many of us. And as I've come more into the academic space, right? Like I've been a practicing planner for a really long time, but as I've come more into the academic space, I've had to think a lot about how am I going to do my research? How am I going to put together, empirical projects where I'm not just helping build a bike lane, but I'm thinking about the approach to how I want to handle data and think about data. And kind of two frames that I try to really implement in all my work. I first try to think about decolonizing methodologies. And what that means is like I think, on this slide, the most important point for me is that I try to think about like the intellectual theory that like helps shape my work, but I really try to think about history. I think too often we come into situations and we think we're going to answer all the questions with data. But whatever question we're trying to answer, there's some historical context there. And when you think about your methodology and how you can decolonize it, one of the things that I think about is how do I rewrite history and how do I rewrite history, right? How do we embrace the history, think about the importance of the history, but think about how the work we're going to do can help change that. The other kind of framework that I think is critical to all my work is Black feminist theory. And the again, a long slide. I'll share these slides so people can read them in more detail. But I think the most important ones for me on this one are the last two. One, that everyday knowledge is important. I think too often those of us who are in the weeds of data, are in the weeds of professionalism and, doing this as our job, we tend to think that knowledge is the same thing as expertise, and that you can only get one of those two things, from having more credentials, right? And if people have heard me speak before, they've heard me use this example, the kids who take the bus everywhere because they can't drive, the grandmother who sits in her living room and peeks out the blinds, and knows everything that's going on her street. Those are experts. You could go to them and say, why do people keep getting hit on the street? And they could say, "Oh, we've been asking for a stop, a stoplight there." That's expertise. And so this idea that everyday knowledge can help drive some of our decision and is in itself reliable and helpful and necessary data is important. And then this idea of a social justice praxis where we can't just, you know, try to do research for research's sake, create policies or programs just for the sake of, well, we have this funding, let's do it. That it really has to have this praxis of how do we think about justice and how do we think about kind of moving the ball forward. And I think that, this is really important to ground all of my work because at the end of the day, like I said, I'm rooting for everybody black. And I love being black. I think it's one of the best things in the world. There is a connection I have, whether or not I'm in Canada or the United States or in Europe, where you're interfacing with other black folks, and there is a kinship, there is a bond, there's a shared experience of so much. And that's not to say that black folks are a monolith and that we're all the same. But I do think we know that it's pretty dope being black, and it can be dangerous, right? And part of why it can be dangerous is because of the way that race has been built into the physical infrastructure of all that we do. And that's why I think that planners and frankly everyone should care about talking about race. I think there's been this journey and planning over time. I probably need to add a new step to this to talk about the current moment we're in our country. But I think overall, as a field, planning was something that I think a lot of people tried to ignore. And it's just, our race was something in planning that people were just like, why do we have to talk about this? And I think there were a ton of people trying to say, because our experience is that race has always been a part of planning. There's the reason, there's the phrase, the other side of the tracks, that you don't want us to think about race in our built environment, but for some of us, we've lived our whole lives knowing that there are certain places we can be and can't be, right? That public space and built environment have always been about this. And you heard me talk earlier about the importance of history and how I like to infuse history. One of the things I always talk about is this book by Madison Grant, which was once referenced by Hitler as like something is like a Bible to him. And Madison Grant is also known as one of the forefathers of the national park system in the United States. Now, again, the national park system is being a little disrespected now, but the national park system is still a system that was built on the theory of we're going to take land away from indigenous people, we're going to put up barriers around it, and we're going to charge people to get in. And if you look at data today, there's still fewer people of color who visit the national parks than than white folks, right? And so that's a part of all that we do. And then when you look at what so many people are facing today, whether or not it's huge freight corridors, whether or not it's just the way that climate impacts frontline racialized communities, communities with concentrated disadvantage more than other communities, there are folks who are like, everything I do in this neighborhood, it's killing me, right? And so now I feel like we've reached this place, perhaps the summer of 2020, and it's continued. And that's why we're seeing backlash. But we have reached this place where people are saying, okay, like I gotta take some accountability that I have a part to play in this, right? I have to do some of the personal work necessary to teach myself this history and to think about how we move forward. And I think that's hard in a field like planning, where at least in the United States, and I've given keynotes for the Conference of Engineers in Calgary, and so I know it's the same. Where in the planning space, white folks are overrepresented, right? There are more white folks in planning than there might be in the general population. It's the same when you talk about scientists and engineers, what, right? White men, white women are definitely a smaller share, but white folks still are overrepresented. So it's the space where race has always been a part of it, but because it's also predominantly been professionalized in a way that too often excludes racialized folks, we don't necessarily think about how we're centering whiteness. And I was lucky enough during the pandemic to work with an organization here, NACTO, the National Associations of City Transportation Officials. They had their conference a few years ago in Toronto. I'm actually at the conference right now in Washington, D.C., hence the cool hotel decor. And something we did for that project is we were trying to figure out how to award money to organizations who were partnering with cities. The money went to the cities, but they had to partner with organizations to think about rapid response to the pandemic. So, if folks can remember back to the pandemic times, that was things like sidewalk dining, open streets, so people could walk and do all of those things when they couldn't, really mix with other people.
Aye,
And
aye.
was that me?
No,
Um,
no, go ahead. Go ahead. Good.
and something we talked about as part of this project I worked on with my colleague Naomi Iwasaki. We were supposed to provide technical assistance for grantees, and we talked to them about the fact that the way racism was showing up in society during the pandemic, it presented new challenges, but that systematic racism and anti-blackness was always there, right? The pandemic plowed through country after country. But in those countries, many of their cities were built on a foundation of racism, segregation, keeping the haves away from the haves nots, and discriminatory practices bolstered those racial efforts. When you think about redlining, when you think about exclusionary zoning, when you think about citing of toxic sites, right? When you think about all of these different things, we know that highway constructions and food apartheid and destroying certain neighborhoods, these public policies were instrumental, and in many cases they were legal, but they were instrumental in setting the stage for the devastating racial disparities and economic opportunity, educational access, and community health that was only exacerbated by the pandemic. And so when I say for too long planning has centered whiteness, I think a great example is during the pandemic. This book, The Color of Law, speaking of redlining, it was on the New York Times top 10. Everyone was reading it because it dug into the history of this book. And Dennis, I enjoyed this book as well. I was on a few panels with the author. But something I always say to people is an example of what does it mean to center whiteness. The subtitle of this book is A Forgotten History of Segregation, right? A forgotten history of how our government segregated America. And that's centering whiteness because who's forgotten this history? If you ask any indigenous or First Nation person on a reservation, have they forgotten about how government has segregated their country? If you ask any person of color who doesn't have generational wealth and a history of home ownership to pass down, we haven't forgotten. And so who are you centering when you say that, right? Who are we citing? Everybody, a lot of folks love this book and go to this book. But there are other people who have written books about redlining and do it from a critical race perspective. Race for Profit is a book that, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, but not as many people know about it. Why? And it tells the same story about how banks in the real estate industry really harmed Black home ownership and tells that same story of redlining without necessarily centering whiteness. And so, another author that grew in popularity during this time of racial reckoning was Robin DiAngelo. She wrote the book Racial Fragility. And something that she says is that oftentimes, eh, we center certain things, but we think we're doing something just completely neutral, right? And I think that's something that's true, especially in the planning field, where we're good people. We want to help people. And so we think we're coming up with these ideas and programs and policies that can be experienced by everybody in the same way. But oftentimes, they're based on the beliefs, perspectives, and experiences of people who are white. And so, again, during the pandemic, there were a lot of open streets events. This was my street in South Central Los Angeles, where, the local Department of Transportation put up these signs. And it happened mere weeks after a young black man was running in a neighborhood in the street, which was presumably a slow street since he could run in it. And he was followed by white men in a truck and killed, right? So even though sometimes we come up with ideas, sidewalk dining, awesome. This is great. We're going to create more space. We're going to feel more European. We're going to be outside. But have we actually invested in the infrastructure so now that the person in the wheelchair or the mom with the stroller can use that sidewalk now that we're sidewalk dining? Have we thought about the fact that there were places in some cold cities that had these like really fascinating like domes they put up with heat so people could eat outside on their sidewalk? But if somebody was unhoused and tried to sleep outside on the sidewalk, we would tell them that they couldn't do that. And so I think sometimes we have to think about who we're centering in the work we do. And that for me is where data really starts to come in. And as I said earlier, I'm from Omaha, Nebraska. Not a lot of people know about Omaha, Nebraska. And so we often place ourselves by thinking about the big cities located next to us. One of the big cities next to us is Kansas City. And for me, a great example about the power of data is thinking about the Kansas City Monarchs. The Kansas City Monarchs were this amazing baseball team in the American Baseball Negro League. And the Negro League was a league started because white folks didn't want black people playing baseball with them, right? There was this whole league before Jackie Robinson was able to play. And what a lot of people don't realize who don't like sports as much as I do is that many of the folks in the Negro League were outstanding. We know about Jackie Robinson, but we don't know about these amazing players. And it's like they didn't exist because we didn't have the data. You think about how data has been popularized in sports, analytics this, analytics that, right? But there was this whole league of talented individuals who so many people who might say they love baseball and are avid fans haven't even heard of. Even if they've heard of the Negro League, they've never heard of these people because sometimes when the data doesn't exist, we cease to believe that something exists. And then we got, lucky and Major League Baseball decided maybe we should include these stats because it's not that they weren't there. It's that data still has a human element. Who's in charge of deciding what data is included? And all of a sudden, you start including this Negro League data, and maybe now the question about who's the best baseball player ever is different, right? And again, it's not because the data wasn't there, it's because those in power chose to ignore it. And so, when I think about why data is important, I come back to this example quite a bit. And I think, one, I look at the slide and I'm like, America, what did we do? But two, I think that data is something that helps us answer questions. It gives us a clearer picture on context to the decisions that we want to make. But it also has impact, right? It lets us break down impacts on individuals in different populations, but also how we break down that data has impact on individuals in different populations. And so we can use the data to decide where we want to go and help us determine how we'll move towards our goals. But data can also have negative consequences, right? There is 100% bias in data. We have to think about how biases impact the conclusions we make. We should really be thinking about, can we ground truth this information? We have data, but can we go to those kids who take the bus? Can we go to the grandmother? Can we go to the community and ground truth and be sure to think about how these biases are impacting the conclusions we make? Data is great, but it doesn't tell the whole story. You have to know what's happening on the ground as well. And we also can't forget that qualitative data is data. And data sometimes has a representation problem. We think we try to do a good job, but data really has to reflect the entire population that you're studying, and it has to do so accurately. And some people will say, well, how do you marry that with what you just said about qualitative data? Qualitative data can't be extrapolated to larger populations, right? But the reality is you have to make sure. That's why they all work together. You can't just ground truth. You can't just do quantitative. You can't just do qualitative. It's how do these things fit together to help us figure out, are we representing folks adequately and accurately? Have we done the work? And sometimes that takes a little bit of time. And most importantly, have we questioned our biases? Have we questioned the biases of the people we're talking to, right? All of these things are important. And I think when you get there, you start to realize that a big part of the process isn't just doing outreach, it's actually doing engagement. And the way I often describe this different to people is sometimes you can only do outreach. You know what? We have a grant to do X, and this is what we're going to do. And so we're just telling you that starting in 2 weeks, this bus stop will be moved 2 blocks because that's what's happening. Engagement is different. Engagement is saying, here's what we want to do. What do you think about that? It's being open to being having that pushback. And again, that takes more time. It's harder. And I don't mean to say you have to do engagement all the time because no community likes to have people come to them and say, "What do you think?" and then completely disregard their feedback. My wife and I have this argument all the time. I'm like, "Why'd you even ask my opinion? You knew what you were gonna do." She's like, "Oh, I just running things through with you, right?" But it doesn't mean it feels better to me. And so when you can only do outreach when the thing is going to happen and you know it's going to happen, then you have the obligation to tell people. But when you have the chance to do true engagement, you have to make the time to do it. And you have to be open to hearing that what you think is best isn't best. I share this slide all the time when I talk. I think it's also important to remember that even though I'm a transportation planner, if I show up at a public meeting, folks don't care that I'm a transportation planner, right? I showed up at meetings as a civil rights lawyer and people were asking me questions about transportation because for the folks that show up at that public meeting, so much of their life is intertwined. They're not thinking about the single issue struggle because they don't lead single issue lives, right? And so our job is, yes, to think about data and be experts at that thing we're experts at, but to also be open to saying, I'm not a housing person. I'm not sure. But even if I can't help you, I can help connect you to someone who can. You know what? That's a good point. I need to raise that in my meetings. I need to bring someone else on my team who can address that issue. And so, if we think about all of these things, now what do we do? Sometimes I give talks and people are like, okay, well, that wasn't inspiring. And lately in 2025, I'm like, well, the world's not inspiring. I'm sorry. I'm just one black woman. I can't change that, right? But I do think people can think about how they can act. This is a slide I always share. It was put together by several Black women who came together at a convening in Salzburg. And it was Black women from South America, Black women from Africa, Black women from the United States, Black women from Europe. And we were thinking, how can we create organizational change? If I want to do something about this work. And the first was you have to create brave spaces to kind of explore the role of power in your work. And brave spaces are not safe spaces because this is not a safe world, especially for low-income folks, folks of color, queer folks, gender non-conforming folks, right? Like, this is not a safe world. Being my authentic self, leaving the house, every day I have to be brave. And so in the work we do, we can at least have that bravery. And bravery also means that you know you're going to make mistakes, but you create the space for when those mistakes happen rather than just calling people out and disregarding them. You call them in and you figure out how to talk through that discomfort, right? You figure out how to make room for apologies and growth. And then you have to understand the role that power plays in your work. A lot of folks like to talk about equity, and you can't talk about equity without talking about power and privilege, right? I think equity is crucial, but in order to understand equity, you have to understand power. And one of the simplest ways I think about understanding power is whenever I'm thinking about a new project or policy or anything I want to do, I think about who's going to be most impacted by this. That could be a positive impact, that can be a negative impact, but who's going to be most impacted by this? And then I look at that decision-making table and I ask myself, are any of those people there? Not is anybody speaking for those people, but are any of those people at the decision-making table? And if not, you have a power imbalance. And then you have to go to that last step and you have to really analyze and challenge yourself and your group about why. Is it because we're having this meeting in English and everybody doesn't speak English? Is it because this meeting was hard to get to? Is it because you had to have a certain credential to get through the door? Is what is it that makes it such that we have the privilege to be here, but other people don't? And if you could really understand power and try to analyze and challenge privilege, you can do a ton with equity. And I like to end because I know we want to leave some time for questions and answers. But lately, I've been ending with this book by Olufemi Taiwo, and he's a professor at Georgetown, a philosophy professor. And he wrote this book called Reconsidering Reparations. And this is a book he uses climate as kind of a framework to talk about, harms and how we think about reparations. But the reason I like to share this book is because in it, he does a really amazing job of acknowledging the fact that we have what he calls a global racial empire. That no matter where you are in the world, you are impacted by race. You have been impacted by this global racial empire that, came about during enslavement and the slave trade. And you've probably have ancestors who helped that empire thrive. Might not have been by choice, but you probably have ancestors who helped that empire thrive. And so he says, as a result, we can't look at reparations through a lens of fault. He says we have to seek to understand liability and the distribution and acclamation of advantages and disadvantages over space and time. And then he says you have to take a minute and you have to think about your ancestors. And you have to think about what kind of ancestor you want to be. And so when I think about that for myself, I think, my work is about helping Black communities. My work is about planning. My work is about centering Black women and queer folks. That's my work. But the global racial empire wasn't built overnight. And so I don't have to change planning overnight. I don't have to change the way people look at data in 1 hour talk, right? I just have to think that no matter what my intervention is, no matter what my work is, no matter what your work is, the actual work, especially in times as dark as these, is to stay in this fight for social justice. We don't have to complete all of the work on our own. We just have to think about, just like our ancestors, we just have to take our piece and we have to figure out how we're going to advance that. And so, as I end, something I hope folks sit with is what kind of ancestor do you want to be? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamika. That was amazing. And I'm sure you can see in the chat and the reactions that it's a unanimous feeling. I really appreciate you making the time to share that with us. Very important, very moving, very inspirational to keep everybody in the fight. I think that's number one, what these Fridays are for. Exactly what you said. You put it much more eloquently than I had. I really appreciate it. Okay, so there's a couple of questions in the chat. And before I start reading the questions in the chat, I'm going to invite anybody who's in the room and wants to turn their microphone on and ask a question or make a comment to go ahead and do that. And in the meantime, I'm going to put in the chat because I know a couple people are asking where they can get the resources and the links to the books and stuff. At the link here in the chat is where everything will be once we've processed the resources and the recording. That's the Data Equity Community Forum. So that's not a membership site or anything. You don't have to belong to that. You can just go and it's there. So if there's anybody in the room that wants to turn their microphone on, please go ahead. Hey, Jamie.
Hi, Heather. Hi, Tamika. Thanks, Tamika. Great talk. I really appreciate your passion and your insight. I work for Common Ground Health. We're a healthcare planning organization in Rochester, New York, and in our work, we're seeing a shift, I think, from studying things like chronic care health and inequities in healthcare. Around conditions of health, but I think there's a shift recently into it's called social determinants of health, and transportation is certainly one of those areas that I think we understand that limitations in that and inequities of that contribute to healthcare issues. So I'm just curious, as we're starting to look into those things and make those connections, do you have any recommendations for what either data sources or ways to engage, I guess, to use your concept, that might help us or help guide us into understanding that a little bit better?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for asking. So I think social determinants of health are definitely growing in prominence. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has been a huge funder of a lot of social determinants of health work and often have a lot of resources on their website. I say all of this with the caveat that everyone's websites are changing lately, and that's something we've really struggled with at UCLA, even where we were like, we got to download these data sets while we still have access to them. But Robert Wood Johnson Foundation often has a lot of great resources on the social determinants of health. That convening in Salzburg that I talked about was funded by Robert Wood Johnson, and it was about the built environment and social determinants of health. MIT's planning program has what they call CoLab. It's a like a center there, and they do a ton about social determinants of health and have some really powerful information on the topic. And then there have been some resources, this is more California specific, but the California Endowment, um, pre-pandemic, and then also during the pandemic, they had started what they called um, building better communities, and they picked kind of throughout the state several communities that they invested in for several years to try to impact the health outcomes with the idea that your zip code shouldn't impact your health outcomes. And a number of they then at the end of it hired a number of researchers to kind of write up and evaluate. And so the California Endowment also has a number of like really great resources.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Thanks. Hey, Dennis. Great to see you.
Likewise, Heather. Thank you. It's good to see you as well. Thank you to you very much for all of your work here. It's wonderful to hear and enjoyed thoroughly every minute. Uh, this one hits a couple different sectors. My question to you, I'm trying to think of, given what you just discussed, what ways would you recommend uh, folks talking about who benefits from these sustained inequitable practices, but doing so in a way that doesn't make it sound unattainable? So something that can be done, some way to start disrupting and upending things without scaring everybody in the world off. Any thoughts on?
Yeah, this is a huge one. I think when I'm on my more flippant radical days, the way I try to explain it to people is like, yeah, this shit is overwhelming. Like it is overwhelming and it might scare you off, but when you think about immigrants who migrate, when you think about black folks, when you think about Any group of oppressed people, how they make it through is they face overwhelming circumstances and they decide that they're just going to keep pushing through. And so something I try to say to folks is like, this is extremely overwhelming. And you have to sit in that. You have to sit in the discomfort and you have to figure out how to still push through because that's what all of the folks who are most impacted by this have to do every single day. Push through with the uncertainty of knowing if they're ever going to move the needle, if they're ever going to be okay. With that being said, I think there's also on my less radical days where I'm like, you know, we got to keep people engaged. We need some wins, right? And I think something that started to become more important is finding joy in the work we do. And so, you know, I think there are a number of researchers and a number of authors who have started to write and do things in a way where they're not just focusing on the deficits and they're not just focusing um, on what's lacking in communities, but they're also trying to uplift the joy of those communities. They're also trying to uplift the resilience. Jay Pitter, who's a Canadian planner and does, you know, work in both countries, I know has been doing some research and is going to be putting out some stuff on kind of like joy in public space. And I think having that framing, the here in LA, the LA County Office of Anti-Racism, Diversity, and Inclusion. They go by ARDI. They have really tried to lead this charge in saying, let's not call communities disadvantaged communities. Let's call them communities of concentrated disadvantage. There's this is happening other places in the country, but they're kind of leading that charge in Los Angeles. And part of what they're saying is let's not call these communities disadvantaged. Let's focus on the actors who have concentrated disadvantage in these communities, but let's talk about these communities is vibrant. Let's talk about these communities is full of resources and culture. And so I think sometimes the way to keep people engaged and not get them overwhelmed is all about how we're framing something. And I'll end with saying there's a professor at UCLA. Her name is Reagan Patterson. She's in the engineering school and she's leading a project I'm working on. Really dynamic young Black professor. And as we were all sitting around, PhD students, like lamenting the world we currently live in, and you know, all the funding cuts and inability to say this word or that word, something Reagan said that I really appreciated is like, you know, I've been doing environmental justice work all my career. I'm gonna do environmental justice work. And I'm focusing less on what I can and can't say and focusing on the fact that if I reframe this moment, this is a moment of purging. This is a moment of people who actually don't care about equity, but have been doing the work because of the buzzword or because of the funding. Now that it's no longer advantageous to them, they're gonna leave the space. And those of us who really care, those of us who are really committed, those of us who really want to listen to people and communities, we're still gonna be here and we're gonna figure it out and we're not gonna get distracted by the language. And I think sometimes that's just an example that sometimes reframing is a way to help with that feeling of overwhelmingness.
So thank you so much. I share that sentiment. I'm in public health and we talk a lot about risk factors. We have actually made the change to talk about protective factors at the same time. So here are things that could cause a problem. Here are things that could benefit, and you want to accentuate those benefits. So
Right.
appreciate your time. Thanks so much again for your time and work.
Always good to see you, Dennis. Tamika, can you say one more time the name of the organization in LA that's using the communities of concentrated disadvantage for us?
I just put it in the chat for
Oh,
everyone.
you did. You did. Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, Allie. Go ahead. Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you very much for this presentation. It was such a great experience for me, and um, I really enjoyed every minute of it. I always struggled in the Canadian context, using law as a tool for social justice. And I was wondering, what is your opinion around this concept, especially in Canada, compared to the United States? We have um, more tools in terms of constitutional law, Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, in my province, Ontario Human Rights Code. So these legal tools are available to us. As far as I understand, we don't use it that much in terms of equity work. And when it comes to data, it's even worse, as if there is no legal structure in place to help us moving this work forward. And I'm very excited to know your opinion about the intersection of law, data, and equity.
Yeah. This is something that I've been thinking about a lot, and particularly because in the United States, where we see so much changing, courts are kind of the last, the last institution where folks think they might have a chance to push back on the administration. And my dissertation work is actually looking at um, how and why law has been used in the fight for mobility justice less than it has perhaps in environmental justice or housing justice, things like that. And so, just to say, I've been thinking about it a lot. I think, in that context, my inclination is in the United States context, at least, that it's hard to use legal action. It takes time, it takes resources, and it takes really good legislation, right? You can, in the United States, sue someone for violating the disability, like the ADA, the American Disabilities Act. We don't have an American Transportation Act, right? And so I think one of the things about doing equity work that you always have to say to folks is like, it would be really great, and I would be much richer if I had a briefcase and I could just go to any context and open up my briefcase and say, this is the equity work. But that's not it. When I worked at Tool Design, we had offices in Edmonton, we had offices in Toronto, and I actually did quite a bit of Canadian work. And in some ways, I liked doing equity work more in Canada because there was more to be said about First Nations and like interactions with that. There was more being done on reconciliation. Surveys, like the way we listed different groups and genders was just way more expansive than we would ever do in the United States. But at the same time, when I talk to my white French Canadian wife's relatives, they don't ever talk about racism. They talk about prejudice, right? And so it's the different context. And I think what I've learned, at least from spending time in Canada with relatives, is that yeah, like it's just a historical difference of the courts have been so key to civil rights in the United States, whether it's school desegregation or whatever it may be, and so many people turn to the courts in this way that is like one of the primary tools in the toolkit, and it's just not the same in Canada. And so the secret to being like an equity ninja is just knowing what's in the toolkit and what works best in each context. And that's not necessarily like a direct answer to your question, but I do think, it's knowing. I was talking to a client about this the other day that was like, we have an office in Africa where most of the planners and engineers are like older men. And we have someone on our team that's a young, like Asian woman. And in that context, it's just different. And so the tools in the toolbox have to be different. And I think that's why I speak so much about history and understanding the history so that you know which of those tools to pull out.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Think that is the absolutely perfect place to leave this. If you want to be an equity ninja, it's not a recipe. It's just getting some tools in your tool belt, knowing which tool to use in which context. Fabulous. Tamika, thank you so much. This was we had high expectations, but our expectations were blown out of the water. So helpful, so amazing, so inspiring, all at the same time. and while you're traveling. So even more generous. For people who want to follow up with the resources, I'm putting the link in the chat one more time. It takes us a little while to process the video and collect all the links, but they will show up there, I promise.
And I
And
will
take
share the slides so that they can be put there. And if we didn't get to any questions, folks should always feel free to email me. It sometimes takes me a while, but I always respond.
fantastic. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Tamika. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.